The moment I realized someone had been stealing my packages, I knew the story wouldn't end quietly. It started with a delivery notification, a photo of a box on my porch, and an empty concrete slab when I opened the door. No box. No knock. Just that sinking feeling that someone nearby felt entitled to whatever I ordered. I brushed it off once. Then twice. By the third time, anger replaced confusion, and that's when the real nightmare began. I live in a neatly manicured neighborhood run by an HOA that prides itself on rules, order, and appearances. Lawns trimmed to regulation height. Trash cans hidden within minutes. And one particular board member who acted like she owned every sidewalk. Her name was Karen, and she wore authority like perfume, thick and unavoidable. She smiled when neighbors watched, scowled when they didn't, and loved reminding everyone who was in charge. The missing packages always vanished on days Karen was outside monitoring violations. I noticed her lingering near my porch, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes darting like she was counting crimes. When I politely asked if she'd seen anything, she clutched her pearls and accused porch pirates, city crime, and careless delivery drivers. Her performance was flawless. Almost too flawless. I installed a door camera. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. Karen walked up, glanced around, lifted my box, and disappeared down the sidewalk like it belonged to her. Watching it felt surreal, like discovering a villain living next door. I considered confronting her, calling the HOA, even filing a police report. But something told me she'd twist the story, bury it in paperwork, and paint me as the troublemaker. That's when a different idea formed. Not revenge. Accountability. If Karen wanted my packages so badly, I'd make sure she remembered taking them. I researched harmless dye packs used by banks, modified one to fit a small box, and tested it carefully. Bright, permanent, impossible to hide. No damage. No danger. Just truth, loud and colorful. As I sealed the package and placed it neatly on my porch, my heart raced. I wasn't sure what would happen next, only that the days of stolen deliveries were about to end. What followed shocked the entire neighborhood and exposed more than just stolen boxes. I stood there afterward, listening to distant lawnmowers and birds, realizing how small choices expose big truths. This wasn't about packages anymore. It was about power, entitlement, and how easily people abuse authority when they think no one is watching. The trap wasn't cruelty. It was a mirror, waiting patiently. And mirrors, revealed, reflect consequences nobody can scrub away. The next morning felt strangely quiet, like the calm before a storm everyone else was too comfortable to notice. I placed the package on my porch just before noon, timing it with the usual delivery window. From the outside, it looked boring, ordinary, forgettable. Inside, the dye trap waited, sealed carefully, pressure tested, and harmless but relentless once triggered. I adjusted the camera angle twice, making sure nothing could be missed. Karen appeared right on schedule. She always did. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched high, she walked the sidewalk slowly, stopping to inspect trash bins, flower beds, and imaginary violations only she seemed able to detect. When she reached my house, she paused longer than usual. She glanced at the street, then at my door, then down at the box. I held my breath, watching the live feed on my phone from inside. She knocked once, lightly, like it was a courtesy. I didn't answer. After a few seconds, she frowned, checked her clipboard, and knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Her shoulders tightened. She leaned closer to the box, reading the label, her lips moving silently. Then she did exactly what she'd done before. She bent down, picked it up, and turned away. What she didn't know was that the dye trigger activated the moment the box tilted past a certain angle. As she lifted it against her hip, a soft pop sounded, barely audible on the recording. A second later, bright blue dye exploded inside the package, spraying through a concealed seam and straight onto her white blouse, hands, and forearms. She froze mid-step. The clipboard hit the ground. Karen looked down, confused at first, then horrified as the color spread, soaking fabric and skin in seconds. She screamed. Not a startled yelp, but a full-throat, furious scream that echoed down the street. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A lawnmower shut off. Birds scattered. Karen dropped the box like it had bitten her. Dye splattered the sidewalk. She tried rubbing her hands together, smearing the color further, panic replacing rage. She ran to my hose bib and turned it on, scrubbing furiously. The dye didn't budge. Water just made it drip, streaking blue down her arms like evidence that refused to disappear. I watched silently, heart pounding, not from fear but from the sheer reality of it happening. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. This was consequence in real time. Karen's composure shattered. She started yelling about vandalism, assault, HOA violations, lawsuits. Anyone who would listen got an earful. But nobody stepped in. They just watched. Finally, she stormed toward her house, still dripping blue, leaving a trail behind her. I knew this was far from over. Karen didn't lose quietly. And when someone like her is exposed publicly, the retaliation is always louder than the crime itself. The dye trap had worked, but it had also lit a fuse. The neighborhood would never be the same after that moment. And Karen? She was just getting started. By evening, the entire neighborhood buzzed with rumors, and every version painted Karen as either a victim or a villain. I stayed inside, replaying the footage, knowing proof mattered more than gossip. Around sunset, sharp knocking rattled my door. Through the peephole, I saw Karen, still stained blue, flanked by two HOA board members wearing tight smiles. I opened the door calmly. Karen launched into accusations immediately, claiming chemical assault, illegal surveillance, and harassment. Blue stains streaked her face despite makeup attempts, making her fury impossible to take seriously. I listened without interrupting, then asked one simple question: would they like to see the video? The color drained from her expression faster than the dye ever could. The board members hesitated, then nodded. Inside, I played the clip from the beginning. Karen walking up. Looking around. Picking up the box. The pop. The explosion. The screaming. Silence filled the room when it ended. One board member cleared his throat. Karen began talking again, loudly, insisting it was entrapment. I calmly explained the dye was non-toxic, designed to identify theft, and that the box was addressed to me. I hadn't invited her onto my porch. I hadn't handed her the package. She took it. They asked if I planned to press charges. I said I hadn't decided. Karen scoffed, but her confidence cracked. The board members exchanged glances and told her they needed to discuss the matter privately. She protested, but they left with her, still arguing on my lawn. That night, the neighborhood group chat exploded. Photos circulated. Blue hands gripping a steering wheel. Blue sleeves under a blazer. Someone joked about Smurf cosplay. Others demanded Karen resign. A few defended her, but even they questioned why she touched someone else's mail. The next morning, a notice appeared on every mailbox announcing an emergency HOA meeting. Attendance mandatory. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. I arrived early, camera footage saved on multiple devices, feeling strangely calm. When Karen entered, whispers followed. She avoided eye contact, arms crossed, dye still visible despite gloves. The meeting began stiffly. Rules were read. Then theft was addressed. When they asked me to speak, I stood, heart steady, and told the truth. By the time I finished, the room wasn't divided anymore. It was unified, and Karen knew it. Power doesn't vanish quietly when exposed. It lashes out first, and I could see the storm forming behind her eyes. I realized then that this fight was no longer personal, it was public, documented, and irreversible. Karen had relied on fear and silence, but sunlight changes behavior. The board couldn't unsee what they'd watched, and neither could the neighbors anymore that night together. The emergency meeting ended without a vote, but the damage to Karen's authority was obvious. She left early, heels clicking like gunshots, while neighbors clustered in quiet conversations that felt louder than any shouting match. Over the next few days, something shifted. Karen stopped patrolling. Notices stopped appearing. The HOA emails grew cautious, neutral, almost apologetic. I thought that might be the end. I was wrong. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived accusing me of endangerment, harassment, and violating community standards. Karen had filed a formal complaint. She demanded fines, reimbursement for clothing, and access to my security footage for investigation. It was a familiar tactic: overwhelm, intimidate, exhaust. This time, it didn't work. I replied with facts. I included timestamps, footage, and a brief legal explanation about mail theft and private property. I didn't insult her. I didn't speculate. I just documented. Then I waited. Silence followed, heavy and telling. On Friday afternoon, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of my house. My stomach tightened, but I reminded myself I'd done nothing wrong. The officer knocked politely and asked a few questions. I showed the footage again. He nodded, thanked me, and walked next door. Karen answered the door wearing gloves and a forced smile. 10 minutes later, her voice carried through open windows, sharp and panicked. The officer left soon after, shaking his head. That night, her porch light stayed on until morning. By the weekend, the story reached beyond our block. A local community page shared screenshots. Comments poured in. Former neighbors described similar encounters. Packages missing. Fines invented. Threats whispered. A pattern emerged, undeniable and ugly. At the next HOA meeting, attendance doubled. The board announced an external audit and temporary suspension of Karen's authority pending review. She stood up, shouting about conspiracies and betrayal, blue stains still faintly visible like ghosts. No one followed her when she stormed out. Watching her leave, I didn't feel victory. I felt relief. The die trap hadn't punished her. It revealed her. And once revealed, the structure protecting her collapsed under its own weight. I realized then that standing up doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it requires patience, evidence, and letting people show who they really are when they think they're untouchable. That lesson stayed with me as the neighborhood slowly recalibrated, learning boundaries long ignored. Cameras went up. Deliveries returned. Conversations grew honest. Accountability, once avoided, became routine. Karen's absence felt strange, then peaceful. I didn't celebrate her fall, I appreciated the correction. Systems work when ordinary people document, persist, and refuse intimidation. The die faded eventually, but the record remained, clear, permanent, and shared. It proved truth travels farther than threats when evidence stands firm in daylight for everyone watching. For a brief moment, life returned to something resembling normal. Packages arrived and stayed put. Neighbors waved again instead of whispering. The HOA emails became bland updates about lawn care and parking, stripped of their threatening tone. But power doesn't disappear overnight. It waits, and Karen was waiting. 2 weeks after her suspension, a rumor spread that she planned to sue the HOA, the board members, and me personally. Some neighbors warned me quietly, others nervously distanced themselves, afraid of being dragged into legal drama. I understood the fear. Karen thrived on it. Even weakened, she still knew how to unsettle people. Then the retaliation escalated. Anonymous complaints started appearing against my house. Noise violations at hours I wasn't home. Trash complaints on days pickup hadn't happened. One notice even accused me of running a home business without approval. It was obvious who was behind it, but obvious and provable aren't the same thing. Instead of reacting emotionally, I documented everything. Dates, times, photos, video, patterns. I requested written confirmation for every violation and appealed each one formally. The board, now under audit, responded carefully, double-checking claims instead of rubber stamping them. Karen's old shortcuts were gone. One afternoon, I noticed her car parked down the street, engine running, windows tinted. She didn't approach. She just watched. The camera caught it all. 15 minutes. Then 20. Finally, she drove off. That footage joined the growing archive. The turning point came when a former HOA board member reached out privately. He admitted Karen had pressured him for years, manipulating rules to target people she disliked. He provided emails, messages, direct proof. He said seeing the DI footage gave him the courage to speak. When the audit report was released, it was devastating. Financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, abuse of authority. Karen's name appeared repeatedly. The board had no choice. Her suspension became permanent removal, followed by a formal recommendation for legal action. Karen didn't show up to the announcement. Instead, a moving truck arrived at her house 3 days later. Blue-stained curtains hung briefly in the windows before disappearing into boxes. Neighbors watched silently as the truck pulled away. I expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt something quieter. Closure. The kind that comes not from revenge, but from resolution. The DI trap had been the spark, but the fire came from truth long buried. That night, I sat on my porch as another package arrived. I didn't rush to grab it. I just watched it sit there, untouched, ordinary again. It struck me how small the original problem had been, and how large the lesson became. Sometimes, standing up changes more than your own situation. It gives others permission to speak. And once people stop whispering, systems built on fear collapse quickly, leaving behind space for something better to grow. With Karen gone, the neighborhood entered an unfamiliar phase, adjustment. Rules still existed, but enforcement felt human again. The HOA board invited residents to open forums, encouraging feedback instead of issuing threats. People spoke cautiously at first, then more freely, sharing stories they'd kept buried for years. I listened more than I talked, realizing how often silence had protected the wrong person. One evening, a neighbor knocked on my door carrying a small box. Inside was a handwritten thank you card and a gift card. She told me Karen once fined her for chalk drawings her kids made on the sidewalk, then threatened further penalties if she complained. She said seeing someone push back changed everything. That moment stayed with me longer than any apology ever could. Not everyone was grateful. A few neighbors avoided me entirely, uncomfortable with conflict even after it ended. I understood that too. Standing up can be inspiring, but it also reminds people of risks they'd rather not face. Change, even positive, unsettles routines built on compliance. The HOA audit continued, uncovering more irregularities unrelated to Karen alone. Policies were rewritten. Oversight increased. Term limits were introduced. Transparency became mandatory. Watching those changes unfold felt surreal, like witnessing a machine being rebuilt while still running. One afternoon, I received an unexpected email from a local reporter. The community page story had reached her desk, and she wanted to discuss accountability within HOAS. I declined an interview, not wanting attention or escalation. The story wasn't about me. It was about what happens when unchecked authority meets quiet resistance. Life slowly simplified again. Deliveries came and went without incident. The cameras stayed up, not out of fear, but habit. Karen's house sold within a month. New owners moved in, unaware of the history, greeted warmly by neighbors determined to start fresh. Sometimes, I replayed that first moment when I sealed the die trap. I thought about how close I'd come to ignoring the thefts, telling myself it wasn't worth the trouble. That realization humbled me. It reminded me how often people tolerate small injustices until they become normalized. The lesson wasn't about die, or traps, or even Karen. It was about boundaries. About knowing when to say enough, and how preparation matters more than anger. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was careful, patient, and documented everything. As seasons changed and lawns turned green again, the neighborhood felt lighter. Not perfect, but fairer. Authority no longer hid behind intimidation. And every time I picked up a package from my porch, I remembered that accountability doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, sealed in an ordinary box, waiting for someone entitled enough to pick it up. Months passed, and the incident slowly transformed from neighborhood scandal into local legend. New residents heard fragments of the story secondhand, usually exaggerated, always whispered with a mix of disbelief and admiration. I never corrected them. The truth was already recorded, and I didn't need credit. What mattered was how the neighborhood behaved differently afterward. The Hoa elections came that fall, and for the first time, people actually ran because they wanted to help, not control. Meetings were held in open spaces, minutes were shared publicly, and enforcement notices required multiple approvals. The culture shifted from punishment to communication. That shift didn't come from policy alone, it came from memory. Everyone remembered what happened when authority went unchecked. One evening, while taking out the trash, I ran into a delivery driver who recognized my address. He laughed and told me drivers had quietly shared warnings about our street in the past. Packages went missing. Complaints followed. He said those warnings stopped months ago. Whatever changed, he said, it worked. Hearing that from an outsider made the impact feel real. I sometimes wondered what Karen told herself after leaving. People like her rarely see themselves as villains. In her mind, she was probably enforcing order, protecting standards, doing what others were too weak to do. That thought didn't anger me anymore. It reminded me how easily righteousness turns dangerous without accountability. One afternoon, a familiar car pulled into the neighborhood. Karen. She stayed inside, windows up, just watching. For a moment, the old tension returned. Then she drove away without incident. That was it. No confrontation. No drama. Just a quiet acknowledgement that her power was gone. Later that week, a package arrived containing a replacement camera from the manufacturer. No note. No explanation. I installed it anyway, not because I expected trouble, but because preparedness had become routine. Boundaries, once learned, aren't easily unlearned. The story followed me in subtle ways. At work, in community groups, even online, conversations about small abuses of power felt closer to home. I noticed myself speaking up more, not aggressively, just clearly. Saying no. Asking for documentation. Encouraging others to do the same. That's how change spreads, I realized. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet confidence multiplied across ordinary people. The die trap was never meant to be symbolic, yet it became exactly that. A reminder that entitlement depends on silence, and silence can be broken. Standing on my porch one night, watching another delivery sit undisturbed, I felt a strange gratitude for the inconvenience that started it all. If those packages had never gone missing, nothing would have changed. Sometimes disruption isn't a setback. Sometimes it's an invitation to redraw lines that should have been there all along. Time has a way of smoothing sharp memories, but some moments refuse to dull. The day the die exploded became one of those reference points, a before and after marker I carried quietly. Long after the gossip faded, the lesson remained, shaping how I saw authority, conflict, and my own tolerance for being wronged. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than enforced. Kids played freely without parents worrying about complaints. Delivery drivers stopped rushing. Even the board members seemed lighter, less defensive, as if a weight had been lifted from their roles. Rules still existed, but they were tools, not weapons. One evening, during a casual block gathering, the conversation turned to boundaries. Someone joked about die packs, and laughter followed, but then the mood shifted into something reflective. People talked about moments they wished they'd spoken up, times they'd let things slide to keep peace. The shared understanding was clear: peace built on fear isn't peace at all. I realized then that what happened had given people a shared story, a cautionary tale that didn't rely on gossip anymore. It was documented, undeniable, and finished. That finality mattered. It allowed everyone to move forward without pretending nothing had happened. Later that night, alone again, I reviewed the old footage one last time before archiving it away. Not to relive it, but to close the chapter fully. I noticed details I'd missed before: the hesitation in her step, the quick glance around, the confidence she assumed would protect her. It reminded me how certainty without consent turns into theft, whether it's packages, privacy, or dignity. I deleted nothing. Evidence shouldn't be erased just because the thread passes. But I stopped watching. Some things are meant to be learned from, not replayed endlessly. Weeks later, a new family moved into Karen's old house. They brought cookies, introduced themselves, and asked about neighborhood traditions. Nobody mentioned the past. Not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer defined the space. That felt like the final confirmation that the cycle had ended. Looking back, the most surprising part wasn't the confrontation, or even the fallout. It was how small actions, handled deliberately, can ripple outward. Preparation beat anger. Documentation beat denial. Patience beat power. The box, the die, the camera, all of it could have been dismissed as petty. But standing up often looks petty to those who benefit from silence. I learned that discomfort is sometimes the price of fairness, and it's usually worth paying. As another delivery notification buzzed on my phone, I smiled, not because of what happened, but because of what no longer did. That quiet absence was the real outcome, and it felt permanent. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory lap or a final confrontation. It ended the way most real changes do: quietly, steadily, and without applause. Months after Karen left, I realized I'd stopped checking the camera every time a delivery notification appeared. That habit, once fueled by suspicion, faded into trust rebuilt slowly through consistency. One afternoon, while breaking down cardboard boxes for recycling, I found the original dye-stained packaging tucked away in the garage. The blue marks had dulled but never disappeared. I almost threw it out, then decided against it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Evidence of a moment when I chose action over resignation. Neighbors no longer brought up the incident directly, but its influence showed in small ways. People asked questions at meetings. They requested written explanations. They pushed back politely but firmly when something felt off. The Hoa didn't resist, it adapted. Authority, once concentrated, became distributed. And with that shift, fear lost its grip. I often thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd confronted Karen emotionally, she would have played the victim. If I'd stayed silent, the thefts would have continued, emboldened by inaction. Preparation was the difference. Calm was the difference. Letting the truth speak for itself changed everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen enforced rules obsessively, yet broke one of the clearest laws without hesitation. That contradiction sits at the heart of entitlement. Rules feel optional when you believe they're meant for others. Accountability feels unfair when you've never faced it before. I didn't set out to teach a lesson. I just wanted my packages to stop disappearing. But small injustices rarely stay small. They test boundaries, probe silence, and grow when ignored. Addressing them early isn't overreacting, it's maintenance. Like fixing a leak before it floods the house. Now, when a package sits on my porch, it's just a package again. No tension. No calculations. No need for traps. That normalcy is the real reward. Peace earned through clarity lasts longer than peace preserved through avoidance. The dye eventually washed off sidewalks and concrete, but not from memory. And that's okay. Some stains are meant to stay, not as marks of shame, but as proof that consequences exist. Proof that ordinary people, when prepared and patient, can correct extraordinary overreach. If there's one takeaway, it's this: document first, react second, and never underestimate the power of quiet resolve. You don't need to be louder than authority. You just need to be right, and willing to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up. And when it does, no amount of scrubbing can make it disappear.